I'm Kathleen Allen. I live in Cottage 63, and I am a registered nurse for over 50 years. I worked from the day I graduated from nursing school, never quit until I moved up here in 2016. In the early days of my career, one of the most wonderful things about being a nurse was you could walk in any hospital in this country and be hired on the spot. You know, they'd almost say, "Can you start this afternoon?" This was great for being a young woman and kind of in the early 70s trying to, sow her wild oats, so to speak, and live here and live there and get a taste of what life was like all over. And in 1971, I'd been working for a few years, and I was looking for a job in Washington, D.C., and I was hired as a civilian nurse in the operating room at Walter Reed Army Hospital. Now, this is the old, historic Walter Reed, the real Walter Reed, not the one that they sort of built as a transition in the early 80s, and certainly not out there in Bethesda with the Navy. This is the real old Walter Reed that you've all seen in pictures. One of the first things you do after you fill out your paperwork is that you get a parking place. And because Walter Reed in those days was right in the District of Columbia, there wasn't a lot of extra space around. So parking places were important, and everyone was assigned their own parking place. And mine was way out in the back, behind the back wards. It was a good hike into the main building where the operating rooms were. And in the OR, you start really early, like at 6 o'clock in the morning. So you have to get there early, get your parking place, walk in all this way into the building. The first day that I went to start work, there's somebody in my parking place. And the same thing the next day, and the same thing the next day, and it was never the same car. It was just random cars, always in my parking place, morning after morning. And after a couple of weeks of this, realizing this was not going to change, I went to the proper office to see what I could do about it. Now, if you don't know this already, you need to know that sergeants run the day-to-day activity on an Army post. It's not the top brass, it's the sergeants. And sergeants have their own little kingdoms that they are responsible for, and they feel very, it's almost like a feudal fiefdom, if you will. And I walked into the office that day, and the real honest-to-goodness sergeant who was in charge of parking happened to be there. And I told him my tale of woe, and he said, "Ma'am, let's just give you a different parking place." So he filled out a sign for my dashboard, signed his name on it, and handed me a map with my new parking place encircled. I headed out the door of the office looking at my map, and I turned back around and went in, and I said something like, "Seriously?" or "Really?" And he said, "Ma'am, I say where everybody parks on this post. You put that card in your dashboard, and nobody's going to bother you." And they didn't. For the next 3 years, until I got married and left Walter Reed to go to Denver, I worked in that operating room, and I parked on the Circle Drive, around the fountain, second place, right smack dab in front of the main door into Walter Reed Army Hospital. Now, who parks there? Top brass that don't live on post, VIP visitors, and me in my little old Ford Pinto. And all I could say for 3 years was, "Thanks, Sergeant." And it kind of goes with, it's not what you know in this life, but who you know. Then I want to tell you, back on that theme of being able to walk into any hospital in the United States at that time and get a job, be hired immediately on the spot. we lived in Denver for 3 years, and then my husband got out of the military and decided to practice in Pinehurst, North Carolina. And I was this Yankee girl, didn't know anything about the South. I figured there would be adjustments, and there certainly were. The language was different, the culture was different, the flow of your day was different, the flow of your week was different. But the one thing I never, ever dreamed took place in the personnel office of the hospital in Pinehurst. And you need to know a little bit. Pinehurst is about an hour and a half south of here. It's in a rural area, Moore County, but it is a resort, golf, and horse community. Very wealthy, like an oasis almost, surrounded by farmland. If you drove at that time about 10 miles out of town, you stepped back in time 100 years. It was just that much of a difference. But they had a very good hospital, and they still have a wonderful hospital because the people who lived in town demanded it and funded it. Lots of Duke doctors came to practice in Pinehurst. Wake Forest, Bowman Gray medical graduates went to practice in Pinehurst. Just a good place to raise a family, but not in the hustle and bustle of a big city. So by that time, I had about 12 or 13 years of experience as a nurse. I felt eminently marketable. And once we got the moving van unloaded and got settled a little bit, I went to personnel at what was then Moore Memorial Hospital. And I can see it today like it was yesterday. I sat down with the director of personnel. I know her name, I won't say it. Handed her my resume and said I was here looking for a job. And she looked me right square in the eye, and she said to me, "Doctors' wives don't work." Say that again. Doctors' wives don't work. And it seems that they didn't. There was one lady who was a radiologist married to a surgeon, and she filled in a little bit for vacations and read some x-rays now and then. But that was the closest there was to being a physician's wife working at that hospital in the middle 70s. And I went home thinking, what planet have I relocated to? Surely they need nurses in this hospital. I mean, it's out here in the middle of nowhere. And I learned very quickly that they did indeed need nurses at that hospital. But doctors' wives don't work. How did I solve it? I thought, what am I going to do all day? I have no children. I like to work. I enjoy being a nurse. I've got to have something meaningful to do with my time. And I was directed to the senior surgeon at the surgical group where my husband was employed. And he pulled strings and twisted arms, and it was not necessarily easy. But he got me hired at Moore Memorial Hospital. And the moral of the story is when I retired from that hospital 30 years later, having worked full-time, continuously, moved on up the ladder, I took great pleasure my last day at work of telling that story to anyone who would listen about the day when I was told that doctors' wives don't work.
Hi, I'm Libby Whitaker. I have an incident that happened when I was a student at Duke in the School of Nursing. Those of us who were having children in the 50s will recall that the doctors had us on very strict diets. We were only allowed to gain 20 pounds throughout our entire pregnancy. As a student, I was working in the obstetric clinic one afternoon, And this lady came in for her weekly check. She was getting near term. And when we weighed her, she had gained considerable amount just over a week. And the doctor was very concerned, very upset with her. And I think he came in and brought a copy of the diet, and he looked at her in a very irritated manner, and he said, "Madam, you are not eating your diet." And she very defensively looked at him and said, "I am too. I eat my diet every night before I have my supper." And that's a true story.
Hi, I'm Diana Spock. As many of you know, I was a nurse aboard the hospital ship, the SS Hope, from 1965 to 1970. HOPE is an acronym for Health Opportunities for People Everywhere. It was the world's first peacetime hospital ship and a global symbol of goodwill. Project HOPE has been on humanitarian journeys all over the world, training healthcare workers, and delivering health services and emergency care to the most needy, often in underdeveloped areas. It equips doctors and nurses not just with skills to treat patients, but the expertise to pass their knowledge on to succeeding generations, thus leaving behind a legacy. HOPE was a working ship, so permanent staff like myself were required to be able-bodied seamen, and we had to get seamen's papers from the U.S. Coast Guard before we could board the ship. The SS Hope was not a new ship. It was an old U.S. Navy ship that was on loan to Project HOPE, and it had been called the USS Constellation between 1945 and 1955. It contained a 100-bed hospital, complete with operating rooms, an ICU, a pediatric ward, and medical and surgical wards, labs, x-rays, physical therapy, etc. There were about 100 permanent medical and nursing staff, plus 44 or more rotating volunteer doctors who came for 2-month rotations. Permanent staff like myself signed on for 1 voyage or 1 year. We were all paid the same regardless of education or skills, and that was $300 per month. Of course, room and board was included. We worked hard 6 days a week. I love nursing and I love travel, so to me it was a perfect combination. The SS Hope had already had 4 voyages. They were to ports of call in Indonesia, in Guinea, West Africa, in Ecuador, and Peru. I was on voyage 5, 6, 7, and 8. My first voyage was to Nicaragua. We were docked on the west coast in the port city of Corinto. Because the SS Hope had started from Wilmington, Delaware, we had to transverse the Panama Canal both ways, which was a delight. I was a nurse in the ICU aboard the ship that year. Every staff member aboard the ship, doctors, nurses, paramedical people, everybody worked with a counterpart from the local community. Whether we were aboard the ship or whether we worked in the local hospitals. We saw many medical conditions that were far more advanced than we would ever see here in the U.S. For instance, a patient might present with a glitter the size of a large grapefruit, a far more complicated extraction. My second voyage was to Cartagena, Colombia, where I was the head nurse in the ICU aboard the ship for that year. My third voyage was to Colombo, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. There I worked ashore in a local hospital in Colombo, training local nurses in their own ICU setting for 6 months. Then I was sent with the HOPE team to an interior town of the country, Kandy, Kandy, for a second 6 months, doing the same thing. My fourth voyage was to Tunis, Tunisia, in North Africa, where I was the assistant chief nurse aboard the ship. The end of that voyage, I was married in Tunisia to a rotating doctor, a pediatrician. He was from Pennsylvania and was here at Duke in pediatrics. And I was from Seattle. I had never been to Durham, North Carolina before. Following my marriage in 1970, we returned to Durham, and during the early 1970s, made several trips back to Krakow, Poland, with Project HOPE, doing nursing assessment and so forth. Project HOPE continues to this day, although the ship itself was scrapped in the early 1970s. Nowadays, teams of doctors and nurses are flown to areas of the world where the greatest need is for health care.
I am Mary Ann Ruig. During the 1950 polio epidemic, I was working with hospitalized adult patients, of which one of them was my 27-year-old brother. And on Sundays, I also helped dispense sugar cubes, which had a drop of Sabin vaccine on it. And to be able to take those, you had to be able to count to the number 2. As a child, I was a victim of the polio, and at that time it was called infantile paralysis, and I have had 3 injections of poliomyelitis vaccine since living here at the Forest at Duke. Another incident, one morning after making rounds with Dr. Davis to see his surgical patients, I checked their charts for treatment orders, finding one order stating Miss Eichelberger, which was my maiden name, was to apply a Rube Goldberg dressing to one of his surgical patients' abdominal incision. Rube Goldberg dressings were not mentioned in my training days, so I was on my own. Fortunately, he was pleased with the dressing and the results.
When I was asked to talk about my career, something interesting about my career as a nurse, it really inspired me to think about that career. I really had not looked completely from the beginning to the end of all that I had accomplished as a nurse. And I decided I'm going to write an account of this, and I'm going to write a book for my children and my grandchildren so that they will see what Grandma and Mom did.
So what I wanted to do was, after going through all of this, was talk about the beginning and the end of my nursing career. I was graduated from Duke University School of Nursing in 1961 with my nursing degree. My husband graduated at the same time, and we were engaged to be married. We had absolutely no money, and I needed a job. So I went home to live with my parents until we were married, got my registration as a nurse in the state of Florida, and with my nursing registration in hand and much confidence, I went to the nearest local hospital to get a job. They offered me a job as charge nurse at night in the emergency room. And I, without even thinking about whether I was competent to do this or if I had the training, accepted the job. I found out that not only was I charge nurse, but I was the only person in the ER at night. But I did have a resident on call when he was not sleeping in the exam room. His name was Dr. Guzman. And so Dr. Guzman and I ran the emergency room for my time that I was there. Fortunately for Dr. Guzman and for me, there was another local hospital that had a trauma center. And that's where most of the accidents and more seriously ill patients were taken. Most of our patients were of the routine nature, women in labor to be transferred to OB, heart attacks, where the physician usually met with us, minor bumps and bruises, orthopedic cases from minor accidents. Those who had been sick for some time and then suddenly they became emergencies in the middle of the night. And then the crazy things that people sometimes did to themselves. I remember one night a man came in. He had been woodworking, and 3 a.m. in the morning, I don't know why, but he had a block of wood stuck in his esophagus. It was things like this that we dealt with. But anyway, somehow, I'll recall losing only one patient during that time, and a lady who was in congestive heart failure. And her doctor and I worked for hours on her, but we did lose her, and that was probably my worst night in the emergency room. So while the rest of the world slept, Dr. Guzman and I took care of the minor emergencies in Jacksonville, Florida. We saw many people, and as far as I know, we helped a lot of them. We didn't kill anybody, as far as we know, and we saved a number of lives. As I look back today, I'm not sure what possessed me to think that I was qualified to work in the emergency room. But it taught me, it was a great experience, taught me much about life and about raising children, which is what I went on to do after that. Fast forward to the end of my career, I had the opportunity through my church to work with women in crisis pregnancies. Educating, counseling, providing resources, and just helping them in any way that we could. I also worked with women who chose to place their babies for adoption. And this was probably one of the most rewarding things that I did, because I came to learn how precious children were to their parents, to their mothers. They made huge sacrifices and made such tough decisions, and it was just very rewarding to work with these women. And we also started a maternity home during this time where we would take care of the women, many placing their babies for adoption and providing them with their needs. As I look back on my career as a nurse, I realize that it began and ended with saving lives. Working with those who were hurting, providing counseling, and I was blessed to be able to do this through the training that I received at Duke University as a nurse.
Okay, my name is Fran Whitfield. I was an active working nurse for 45 years, and I loved every day of my work. I loved my patients, and they loved me. When I was 7 years old, I got a nurse's kit for my birthday. And oh, I was so thrilled. I put that white pinafore on with the red cross, and I thought I was hot stuff. I would take rose thorns and give my brother and sister and playmates a shot in the arm. It would bleed, they would cry, and I would be so thrilled. Well, that's when my love of nursing began. And I ended up in the operating room, 33 years in the operating room. About 30 of them as the operating room supervisor. I have trained more residents than you can shake a stick at. When they first started operating, and I may be stepping on somebody's toes, I don't know, they were very cocky and arrogant, and they would be mean to the nurses. I would call in my office and I'd say, listen here, I'm going to talk to you like your mother. Your nurse is your best ally, and she can help make you or she can let you fall. So I would suggest you treat her with courtesy. And they did. There were many, many residents at my retirement party. I loved nursing. I was the OR supervisor at the VA. I was actually working there when we did the first heart transplants, as a matter of fact. So my history in nursing goes back a long ways. I retired for 3 years while my grandchildren were born, and then I went back to work at PPD Pharmaco, where we did clinical trials and gave first-time-in-human drugs, and developed generics, and I loved it. I loved nursing, and I miss it so much.
Hello. I never really wanted to be a nurse. Little did I dream that nursing would become a magic carpet for me. World War II was raging at this point, and there was a call for nurses. If one joined, she was called a cadet nurse and was given a uniform and tuition and $15 whole a month. I chose to join and to go to Chicago to St. Luke's Hospital, which was affiliated with Northwestern University. It was a very interesting time to be studying nursing because most of the registered nurses were in the service. Advanced students were in charge of some wards during evening and night duty. St. Luke's was a large hospital, so we got a great deal of experience in all areas. We often worked 12 hours a day and went to classes even when we were working evening and night shifts. While we were working nights and or evenings and had to go to class, a friend would always come and sit next to us so that we wouldn't go to sleep and fall off the chair. The doctors from Northwestern who taught us were interesting, but there were a number of departments in which we spent learning time. I loved the nursery. One of our jobs was folding diapers. When we had finished that and our regular care, we each had a favorite baby and would hold it, probably sent it home wanting more. In psychiatry, I was at first uneasy about being locked up with crazy people. I soon found out that they were just people with problems of the mind or spirit. At that time, the research had not been done to show that many problems were related to drug imbalance, so there were none of the drugs that are now so helpful. I was worried about how I would deal with surgery. I found that we were so busy in the operating room that there was no time to be squeamish. One thing that happened was a shocker. Dr. Giza de Tackett was amputating a leg. Suddenly, he threw the leg to me. And I went right down on the floor with it and then got up and put it on the side table. Later, he patted me on the fanny and said, "Darling, you are not only beautiful, you are smart as a beep." In those days, we thought that was fun. We didn't consider it sexual harassment. On the medical unit with Miss Marsky, we learned a lot about cardiac nursing. We also learned that whenever a doctor came near the desk, we better stand up in a hurry. This was in the early days of penicillin. We had to save the urine of people who were getting it. It was given by injection in the gluteus maximus, and you know what that is, in the fanny. One day when I went into a room with the injection, the man said, "Look, you're a cute little nurse, but if you come near me with that thing, I'll probably take a swing at you. I'd rather die than have another one of those." I smiled and left. On general surgery unit, there was a big ward. There were at least 20 people in beds there. When we were taking care of the patients, there was a lot of joking and fun. The patients also helped one another. There were few private rooms, and these only for very ill patients. Food was brought up to the floors on a dumb waiter, and this hospital had 20 floors. Anyway, after it came up on the food on the dumb waiter, we carried the trays to the patients. I got quite good at balancing a tray of food on my hand and one shoulder. We spent 3 months at the Chicago Contagious Disease Hospital. There, one of my most heartbreaking experiences occurred. A polio epidemic was raging, and we had many very ill children. One day I was assigned to a 10-year-old boy with bulbar polio, which was rapidly shutting down his lungs. There was only a dozen respirators available, and all were full. I was wearing a cap and mask and gown as regulations required. Johnny, my little boy, said, "I can't see you. Are you real?" And then, "I think I'm going to die. I would like to see you. I can't see you. I want you to be real." I took off my cap and mask and held him in my arms until he died. The student nurses lived in dormitories. The rules were very strict, and any infringement led to dismissal. About 50 of us started the 3-year course, and only 34 were graduated. The curfew for dates during the week was 10 o'clock, and we could stay out until 11:30 on Saturday night. Whenever we could, my best friend and I took a bus and went to the end of the line. Then we explored the neighborhood and had a meal. Chicago was a very interesting city, and in the evening there were a number of places with music where you could just walk in and hear people like Louis Armstrong for the price of a drink. The Lake Michigan Park was fun with a band shell and which had concerts often, Buckingham Fountain, and the Lake Michigan Walk. Many people moored their boats there, and we enjoyed watching them. It was 3 exciting, interesting, difficult years. And then I earned my RN. Later on in my life, I found myself with several children still to bring up, but I went back to college and got my BSN and got a master's degree in public health nursing. So nursing really has been a magic carpet for me.
Registered nurses practice by law on a single license granted by the state in which they live and work. But this license differs from other professional licenses in that it allows the nurse to work in a very wide range of places and activities. On one end, she could work in an insurance company call center and have absolutely no patient contact whatsoever. On the other end of practice, she could be a sexual assault nurse in an emergency room and regularly engage in the most intimate patient contact imaginable. It's this wide range of practice opportunities that makes a working lifetime potentially so interesting and so secure. For instance, one could begin in pediatrics and be surprised to find that kids just aren't your cup of tea. And so after a reasonable length of time, you don't want to be labeled a job hopper. You watch for opportunities and move on. You could work in the Forest at Duke Health and Wellness with the same patients, we call them residents, for years. Or you could work in an endoscopy clinic where patients spend a very short time, mostly sedated, and you could never in your whole life see them again. You might just like working night shift with any kind of patients, not care, peds, orthopedics, adults, whatever, but you really like working nights. And yes, there really are people who really like working nights, and they should be very highly paid. I was among the world's worst night shift nurses. You can't fool me. When the sun goes down, it's time to sleep. Some nurses try out a few specialties, assignment areas, and shifts until they find one that suits them good enough and make it a career. The really lucky among us land often accidentally in an area that we simply love. And that was how it was for me in oncology, in cancer care. I never considered it. I fell into it by accident. I got swept up in it and stayed for 30 years. Our patients were often sick. They were scared and cranky. They were scared and silent. They were facing who knows what. They were in the middle of the worst thing that had ever happened to them in their lives, and they were confused about their choices. Family members suffered their own fears and wondered how they should behave towards their loved one in this situation. Some patients came for treatment only once, didn't do any good, and they never came back. Others came on and off for years. We became like an odd family, not so sure how we were related to one another, but related we were. I just had a conversation with Ann Husner about this, and it came to mind, what makes a good oncology nurse? And I decided that it's equanimity, unflappableness, giving off a vibe of you are safe with me. Personal characteristics of a really good oncology nurse. For instance, if you work in pediatrics, you have to be a little playful to get along with the kids and to put them at ease. But in oncology, playfulness is not appropriate. Our senior oncologist had seen nurses come and go, and he believed he knew what made a good cancer care nurse, one who could do the often sad job in a caring, helpful, proper way, but not become so wrapped up in her patients' situations that she could no longer guide them through treatment the way she should. You have to preserve your objectivity, and you cannot become what the psychologists call enmeshed in others' lives. This oncologist of ours often said, figuratively of course, you can only fall in love with 4 patients a year. Otherwise, you won't last in this line of work. One year, one of my 4 was a dear farm lady from out in the country. She was on chemotherapy for a while. It helped her for a while, long enough for us to get to know her and her husband. I liked her, and she liked me. She always asked me to give her medicine, and that, by the way, is a huge compliment. She felt safe with me. We watched her over time as she improved on treatment, plateaued, and then dwindled as the chemo was making her feel worse than any benefit it was giving her. It just wasn't worth it anymore. When I saw her the last time for a treatment, she was clearly not good, and we danced around the inevitable. What's the right thing to say when you know you're not going to see her again? As she got up to go, she held my arm, and she said, I know I ain't coming back. I just want to thank you for always being so nice to me. When I get where I'm going, she said, I'm going to make a place right next to me and save it for you. Because there's nobody I'd rather sit next to till the end of time. It still chokes me up. This little story used to float around nursing circles years ago. Probably true, who knows? But about a desperately ill man in an ICU who either, at change of shift one day, either choked out these words or scribbled them on a piece of paper to communicate. And he said, let me get through this. I prayed nothing bad would happen until you got here. Ponder that. There's no bigger compliment.